The night had swallowed Harrow's end whole, leaving only the faint rustle of corn stalks to fill the vast silence. Thomas Grady stepped cautiously into the heart of the oldest cornfield, the moonlight casting long, flickering shadows that danced like specters between the towering stalks. Each breath he took felt thick, heavy with the damp earth and the sharp tang of something ancient and terrible lurking beneath the soil. Whispers slithered through the corn, faint at first, like the murmur of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. But as Thomas advanced, they grew louder, more insistent voices that clawed at the edges of his sanity. They called his name, pleaded, threatened, weaving a tapestry of dread that wrapped tight around his chest. The harvest spirit was near. His fingers brushed against the cold. Weathered stone half buried beneath twisted roots and wilted vines the sacrificial altar. Stains of crimson marred its cracked surface, fresh and glistening under the moon's pale gaze. The pact his ancestors had forged so long ago, binding the land to blood and sacrifice, pulsed with a malignant life. Thomas's heart hammered, each beat echoing the weight of generations. He had spent weeks unraveling the secrets, wrestling with disbelief and fear. Now, faced with the spirit itself, the reality was undeniable. The crops would not yield without a price paid in human blood, and that price demanded a sacrifice. "You know why you're here, Thomas Grady," the voice whispered, serpentine and cold. The shadows around the altar shifted, coalescing into a vague humanoid form, its eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly hunger. The cycle must continue. One must fall so many may live. He swallowed hard, the taste of earth and iron filling his mouth. "Why me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why must I be the one?" The harvest spirit's form rippled like smoke, the voice now a chorus of tormented souls bound to the soil. "Your blood carries the legacy. The pact binds you as it binds the land. To break it is to invite ruin." Memories surged unbidden, his father's stern warnings, Old Man Harrow's cryptic tales, Maggie's desperate hope. He thought of the village, the frightened faces, the empty homes, the whispers of those lost to the fields. And of Eli, his brother, whose faith in the old stories had driven them apart. A shiver ran down Thomas's spine as the whispers crescendoed into anguished screams, the cornfield trembling as if alive. The spirit demanded an answer. His thoughts fractured, torn between duty and survival, between sacrifice and rebellion. Could he offer himself to save the village, perpetuating a curse written in blood? Or could he defy the ancient covenant, risking annihilation but striving to free Harrow's end from its dark legacy? Suddenly, Maggie's voice broke through the storm of despair, clear and resolute in his mind. "There has to be another way, Thomas. We found the journal. We have the knowledge. You don't have to face this alone." He closed his eyes, drawing on her strength, the warmth of her belief amidst the cold shadows. The whispers faltered, as if sensing his wavering resolve. Opening his eyes, Thomas stepped closer to the altar, the night air thick with tension. The harvest spirit's gaze bore into him, waiting. "I will not let this curse define us," Thomas declared, voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I choose to end this no matter the cost." The shadows writhed, the whispers twisting into a furious roar. The ground shook beneath his feet, and the air grew electric with ancient power. Thomas felt the pulse of the land, the hunger of the soil, and the weight of his ancestors crushing down. Then, silence. The cornfields stilled. The harvest spirit's form dissolved into the mist, leaving only the faintest echo of a whisper, a promise or a threat yet to be understood. Thomas sank to his knees, breath ragged but spirit unbroken. The choice he had made would shape the fate of Harrow's end forever. The dawn was still hours away, and the shadows had not yet fully retreated. But, for the first time, hope flickered in the darkness, fragile, trembling light against the vast night. He would fight for his village. He would confront the legacy of blood and shadow. And whatever came next, he would face it with open eyes and a steadfast heart. As Thomas rose, the first faint hints of dawn brushed the horizon, casting a pale glow over the silent fields. The whispers had ceased, but their memory lingered, a haunting reminder that the harvest was far from over. The sky hung heavy and grey over Harrow's End as dawn broke on the day following the sacrifice. Thomas Grady stood alone in the heart of the oldest cornfield, the stalks around him bent and broken, trampled underfoot in the chaos of the night before. The sacrificial altar, a crude stone slab entwined with ancient symbols, lay empty now, its surface stained dark with fresh blood that had seeped deep into the soil. An oppressive silence weighed down the air, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves stirred by a cold, lifeless breeze. Thomas's breath came ragged, his chest tight with exhaustion and grief. Around him, the whispers that had haunted the village for weeks had finally ceased, replaced by a heavy stillness that seemed unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The price had been paid, a sacrifice so profound that it had torn through the very fabric of the community. He lowered his gaze to the bloodied ground, the red stains a stark reminder of the horror endured, and the burden now carried by all who remained. Back in the village hall, a gathering of survivors huddled together in the dim morning light. Faces once alight with festival joy were now drawn and pale, etched with sorrow and fatigue. Maggie Ellis moved quietly among them, her gentle hands offering herbal teas and remedies meant to soothe trembling nerves and aching hearts. Her auburn hair caught the weak sunlight filtering through the cracked windows, and her kind eyes shone with both compassion and a fragile hope. Despite the overwhelming grief, she remained a pillar of strength, her knowledge of the old law offering a slender thread of comfort to those willing to grasp it. The hall was heavy with unspoken words and shared pain. Some sat in silence, staring blankly ahead, while others whispered prayers or clutched remnants of loved ones lost. The air was thick with the scent of earth, sweat, and smoke, a ghost of the rituals that had unfolded in the fields just hours before. Outside, faint echoes of the past seemed to linger, a sigh of wind through the broken stalks, a distant creak of a shutter, the soft murmur of a forgotten curse. Sheriff Daniel Crow patrolled the village streets at twilight, his sturdy frame casting long, distorted shadows beneath the flickering lanterns. His weather-beaten face was etched with lines of worry and weariness, and his usually gruff demeanor was softened by the weight of helplessness. He had done all he could to maintain order as panic had gripped the town, but the events had surpassed any law he could enforce. Now, he walked silently, the empty streets a stark reminder of the lives shattered and the community fractured. Each step echoed in the quiet, his hand resting near the holster, more out of habit than hope. The law had limits here, against ancient pacts, restless spirits, and the primal hunger of the land itself. Crow's mind wrestled with the futility of his role, yet he remained resolute. Protection meant more than enforcing rules. It meant standing guard in the face of a darkness that no badge could contain. Meanwhile, on the porch of the Grady farm, Eli Grady sat hunched against the chill evening air, his gaze fixed on the darkened expanse of the cornfields that loomed like silent sentinels beyond the yard. His hands trembled as he clutched a worn wooden cross, murmuring prayers in a voice barely above a whisper. The loss of friends, family, and the innocence of the village weighed heavily on him, his youthful faith shaken but clinging desperately to hope. Ela's eyes reflected the flickering light of a nearby lantern, haunted and wide as memories of the nightmare danced behind his lids. The whispered voices, the screams, the final moments of sacrifice, these would not simply fade. They were etched into the soil, into the air, into the very essence of the land he had known all his life. The future was uncertain, shadowed by fear, but somewhere deep within, a fragile spark of resilience flickered. Thomas returned to the village just as night fell, his form silhouetted against the dying light. Faces turned toward him, a mixture of relief, suspicion, and sorrow. The villagers saw in him both the burden-bearer and the man changed irrevocably by the horror he had faced. Words were scarce. None could capture the depth of what had transpired. Instead, they shared glances heavy with understanding and loss. That night, the cornfields lay quiet. The once relentless whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie calm that unsettled even the most stoic. The darkness had receded, but none dared believe it was vanquished. Thomas stood at the edge of the fields, listening intently to the silence, feeling the weight of the ancestral curse that had been momentarily stilled, but never truly broken. As the village drifted toward a restless sleep, the wind stirred faintly, carrying with it the faintest hint of a whisper. It was a sound not of reassurance, but of warning. A reminder that the harvest spirit's hunger remained patient, eternal, and waiting for the next cycle to begin. The scars of the harvest would never fully heal. The shadows within the cornfields held their secrets close, and the people of Harrow's End would forever carry the price of the whispers in their hearts. But amidst the dread and despair, a seed of hope endured, fragile, like the first green shoot breaking through the scorched earth after a storm, promising that perhaps, one day, the village might rise anew from the harvest of shadows. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the cornfields that surrounded Harrow's End. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the fields were quiet. No whispers rustled through the stalks, no eerie voices floated on the wind. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of his land, hands deep in the pockets of his worn jacket, eyes scanning the unmoving sea of corn. The silence was heavy, almost too heavy. Relief battled unease in his chest. The village was alive. The missing, unaccounted for, but at least no new horrors had claimed more victims in recent days. Yet the oppressive stillness clung like a shroud. Behind him, the village stirred awake. The scars of the recent horrors were etched deep into the faces of Harrow's End's survivors. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted with an urgency born of fear, but life persisted. Thomas turned away from the fields and made his way toward the town square, where the faint sounds of morning routines began to creep in. The clatter of pots, murmurs of cautious conversations, and the distant crow of a rooster. The harvest festival had long ended, but the shadow it cast remained. Inside a modest home near the center of the village, Maggie Ellis sat at a wooden table strewn with notes and the worn, leather-bound ancestral journal. The flickering candlelight illuminated her auburn hair, and the steady determination etched into her features. She traced the faded ink of the pact made generations ago, the grim covenant with the land that demanded a terrible price. Though the whispers had ceased, Maggie knew that the cost of survival was far from over. The journal held secrets, hints at rituals that could protect the village without feeding the malevolent spirit. But the path was uncertain, and the sacrifices already made weighed heavily on her heart. Thomas entered, his boots creaking softly on the wooden floor. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of shared grief and resolve passing between them. "We can't let our guard down," Maggie said quietly, closing the journal. The silence feels wrong, like it's holding its breath. We survived this storm, but the clouds haven't fully cleared. Thomas nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. I know. But what else can we do? We're still here. The fields are still standing. Maybe the worst is behind us. Maggie's gaze flickered with a mixture of hope and doubt. Maybe, but I'm going to keep searching. There has to be a way to end this, not just survive it. Outside, the village gathered cautiously for a meeting in the community hall. The room was filled with weary faces marked by loss and sleepless nights. Sheriff Daniel Crow stood near the doorway, his weather-beaten face tight with concern but softened by the sight of familiar neighbors. Sarah Pike sat quietly in a corner, exhaustion and grief shadowing her usually steady demeanor. The community was fragile, a tapestry of fear and tentative hope. Thomas addressed the group, his voice steady but tinged with fatigue. We've been through hell, and I know the silence feels like a reprieve, but we have to be ready. This land, this curse, it's part of our history now. We're tied to it, whether we like it or not. We need to rebuild, to watch over each other, and to stay vigilant. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. Plans were made to reinforce patrols around the fields, to share information, and to support those who had lost loved ones. The village was determined to reclaim its peace, but the scars ran deep. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Sarah Pike walked the edge of the village. The cold air bit at her skin, her breath a steady plume in the darkness. The fields stretched endlessly before her, silent and still. Suddenly, a faint rustle stirred the silence. Her heart jumped, muscles tensing as she scanned the shadows. But there was nothing, only the gentle sway of corn under a whispering breeze that wasn't really whispering at all. She exhaled slowly, a fragile hope settling in her chest, tempered by the lingering fear that the darkness was merely sleeping, waiting for its next moment to awaken. Back at the Grady farm, Thomas stood once more at the field's edge, gazing into the silent rows. The weight of his ancestors' choices pressed down on him. He had survived, but the cost was etched in every lost neighbor, every shattered family. The harvest of shadows had passed for now. But the uneasy peace reminded him that some darkness never truly dies. It waits, patient and hungry, beneath the surface. As the village slept, Thomas's thoughts drifted to the future. He would keep watch. He would protect his people. And if the whispers returned, he would be ready. For in Harrow's End, the land held its secrets tight, and the shadows were never truly gone. The air inside Old Man Harrow's study was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, a tangible weight pressing down on Thomas as he stepped across the creaking wooden floor. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, where shelves sagged under the burden of ancient tomes and brittle parchments. Harrow sat hunched behind a battered desk, his gnarled hands clasped tightly, eyes like storm clouds reflecting years of burden. "You must understand," Harrow began, his voice low and gravelly, "this pact we made. It was never meant to be broken, not truly. Our ancestors bargained with forces older than the land itself. The harvest spirit is bound to the soil, to the blood spilled in its name. Even if the sacrifices stop, the hunger doesn't die. It waits, it watches." Thomas felt a cold shiver trace his spine. The old man's words were not mere superstition. They were a somber truth carved into the very roots of Harrow's End. He glanced to Maggie, seated quietly nearby, her face drawn but resolute. "So, what then?" Thomas asked, voice rough with disbelief, yet tinged with a desperate hope. "Is there no end to this? No way to finally set things right?" Harrow shook his head slowly. The darkness is patient. It ebbs, but it never leaves. We can only hold it at bay, honor the land carefully, and never forget what was sacrificed to reap its bounty. The weight of the past settled heavily on Thomas's shoulders as he left the study, stepping out into the chill of dusk. The cornfields stretched before him, their stalks silent and still under the fading blood-red sky. The usual whispering was absent, replaced by a haunting quiet that felt more menacing than any sound. He moved to the edge of the field, fingers brushing against the dry husks. The pacts' shadow lingered here, an invisible presence pressing against his skin, reminding him of the cost that had been paid and the price yet to come. It was not just a memory, it was a warning. Back in the village, the community gathered in Maggie's small kitchen, the hearth's warm glow contrasting the chill outside. Faces were etched with exhaustion and grief. The recent losses had hollowed the spirit of Harrow's End. Murmurs of fear and uncertainty filled the room. But beneath the despair was a glimmer of unity. Maggie met Thomas's gaze across the circle, her eyes steady. They shared an understanding. Despite the darkness that had descended, they would endure. They must. That night, Thomas sat alone on his porch, the wind carrying faint whispers across the barren fields. Though silent, the atmosphere was heavy with an unseen presence, as if the land itself held its breath. He knew the harvest spirit was not gone, it was merely waiting, patient and hungry. With a deep breath, Thomas resolved to remain vigilant. The pact's legacy was an echo that would never fade, a shadow cast long over Harrow's End, but as long as he stood watch, he would fight to protect what remained of his home. The whispers might return, the darkness might rise again, but so would the village scarred, fearful yet unbroken. And with that fragile hope, the night closed in once more over the silent fields. The sun dipped low over Harrow's End, casting the last golden rays through the skeletal remains of the cornfields. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the withering stalks, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily against his chest. The air was thick with the scent of dried earth and fallen leaves, a stark reminder of the harvest that had come with such a terrible price. His breath formed faint clouds in the cooling evening as he waited, the anticipation knotting in his stomach. Eli appeared from the shadow of a weathered fence, his steps hesitant. The younger brother's pale face was drawn tight, eyes flickering with a mix of fear and stubborn resolve. "Thomas," Eli said quietly, voice barely above the whisper of the dying fields. "I didn't think you'd come." Thomas offered a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But we need to talk." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them heavy and charged. The rift that had formed between them was deeper than either wanted to admit, a divide carved by belief and doubt, by the horrors they'd witnessed and the truths they refused to face in the same way. "I know you don't believe," Eli began, voice trembling, "but I've seen what the fields can do. The whispers, the disappearances. It's real, Thomas." Thomas looked away, jaw clenched. "I believe in what I can see and touch," he said. "That's what I've always believed. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe there's more to this than I wanted to accept." Eli's eyes softened. "We're both scared. That's all this fight is about." The brothers' conversation was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Maggie Ellis emerged from the path, her auburn hair catching the last light, her steady gaze lending a calm that both men needed. "I'm glad you're talking," she said gently. "The village needs that, people coming together instead of tearing apart." Inside Maggie's small kitchen, a fire crackled in the stove, casting flickering shadows across the worn walls. She had invited a handful of villagers who, like her, hoped for a way forward beyond fear and suspicion. The heavy journal lay open on the table, its ancient script a beacon amidst the darkness. "The pact is broken," Maggie explained to the group, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "But the legacy remains. We have to understand it if we want to heal." The villagers listened, some nodding slowly, others exchanging doubtful glances. The pain was fresh, and trust was fragile. "We can't forget what happened," Sarah Pike said softly, her voice breaking. "But maybe we can learn from it." Outside, the village wore its scars like a shroud. Boarded windows stood as silent sentinels to loss. Abandoned homes whispered of vanished families, and the streets echoed with memories too painful to voice aloud. Thomas walked through the ghostly stillness, each step a reminder of battles fought and lives forever changed. Later, in the dim light of the community hall, a meeting was called. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken grievances. Old resentments flared as neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, the trauma having split the village along fragile fault lines. "We have to find a way to move forward," Thomas urged, his voice rising above the murmur. "Together." But the path to unity was fraught with obstacles. Voices rose in argument, some accusing others of cowardice or complicity. Yet beneath the discord, a fragile hope took root, a shared desire for healing, however distant it might seem. As the meeting adjourned, Thomas stood by the door, watching the villagers drift away into the night. The fractured bonds of Harrow's End would take time to mend, but in the quiet determination of a few, there was a promise that the darkness might one day be held at bay. He turned toward the fields once more, the whisper of the wind through the stalks carrying both warning and hope. The harvest had ended, but the struggle for the village's soul was far from over. "We'll find a way," Thomas whispered to the shadows, "or we'll fall trying." And with that, he stepped into the night, ready to face whatever came next.